on effective, efficient, and durable national climate policies. CCL is technology neutral and supports nuclear energy along with other technology options, cost-effective decarbonization, and equitable distribution of the benefits of it. There's rapidly growing interest in nuclear, and we are so thankful for Dr. Adam Stein to join us today. But before we get to that, Jim, I want to hand it over to you to tell us about the Nuclear Energy Action Team.
Hi, guys. I'm Jim Hoff. The Nuclear Energy Action Team was formed within CCL a few years ago, and it has three main objectives. The first objective is to meet with nuclear utilities and companies and talk to them about carbon pricing and how it would benefit them, because frankly, carbon pricing is a very good policy for nuclear. It treats nuclear and renewables the same. Another objective of the team is to be a source of expertise on nuclear energy. We also have a place on the CCL website where there's forums, you can learn about stuff and engage in discussions. But it's also a place within CCL where there's a concentration of expertise where CCL members can go to tap that extra expertise on nuclear. We've had that happen a few times. People asked for information about nuclear, and in a few cases, we actually gave presentations for chapters of CCL about nuclear energy. And the third objective is to provide guidance to CCL members on how to talk to legislators about nuclear, particularly nuclear supportive legislators. So we give them advice on how to most effectively do that, and hopefully maybe get those nuclear supportive legislators on board with carbon pricing, because again, it's a very good policy with respect to nuclear. So those are the three main objectives of the team, and we're happy to have you guys on this call. Oh, I should point out that I mentioned the education aspect of the team. That's one of our objectives. Things like this that we're putting on today is another example of us doing that, educating CCL members about nuclear power
and beyond. So yeah, we are really honored to have Dr. Adam Stein, who is the Director of Nuclear Energy Innovation at the Breakthrough Institute. So Adam's going to talk about how the kind of U.S. Congress has mandated the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to transition their approach to be a performance-based, technology-inclusive, risk-informed, and consequence-oriented one. So that's a mouthful, and there's nobody, I think, who knows what all those things mean and how they work and what we can do than Dr. Adam Stein. So over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. I put together a few slides for this. Hopefully they come up just fine.
We see them.
Awesome. I like when technology works. So as most of you know on this call, or I'm sure probably all of you on this call, in fact, I know most of you on this call, so it's nice to see all of you again. There's strong public interest in nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is needed to meet climate goals. It's also necessary to reduce health and safety impacts. It improves overall safety of the electrical grid, apart from just climate reductions or carbon reductions. And it enables a just energy transition for many communities where renewables just wouldn't provide those components. To effectively distribute or deploy nuclear energy, regulators must be ready to do that. And there have been modernization efforts for more than a decade now. In fact, the NRC put in place a strategic plan about 13 years ago, but progress has been stalled for many years. I added a note at the bottom here that applicants must be ready too. It's not just the NRC that needs to modernize. Applicants need to be ready to engage effectively with regulator at the same time. But that's difficult for both of them when the regulatory landscape is changing continually. There's 25 companies currently in some form of application or pre-application, and every single one of them is taking a different approach to licensing because regulations are changing so quickly right now that it's difficult to incorporate everything that's brand new, and some of them choose not to incorporate the newest rules. So why do we have to actually modernize regulation? Well, the regulations don't fit new technologies in many ways, and I'll cover some of them specifically. The NRC also doesn't consider the benefits of nuclear energy to society in its current regulatory posture. Although the Atomic Energy Act and the Energy Reorganization Act that established the NRC require that atomic energy be used to maximize the benefits of society, the NRC does not see that as part of its mission. Even if those two things are fixed, the NRC needs to operate more efficiently and build capacity to be able to license what could be a large influx of applications. Another challenge that's being considered right now in current rulemaking is reconsidering the risk paradigm, and I'll talk about that a little bit more explicitly later as well. And finally, what is Congress's role in all of this? One area where the NRC can modernize and be most effective in enabling applications for many different technologies is moving to a performance-based regulatory design. Existing regulations are what's known as deterministic and prescriptive. That means that the NRC is determined that certain requirements must be met to achieve safety, and it prescribes in explicit detail in many cases exactly how to achieve those outcomes. A deterministic regulation can be more efficient for specific uses. For instance, if the NRC said you must have a certain amount of backup cooling water on hand or flow available for cooling for an accident, it's way more efficient for a plant to show that they meet that specific criteria and move forward. But that's not flexible and can have unintended outcomes. So a performance-based approach focuses on the objectives. What are you trying to achieve? Correctly defining that objective can have major benefits. It provides clarity of what you want to achieve, so the applicant knows exactly what you're trying to get at with a certain regulation. But it also avoids many of these unintended outcomes, whereas the applicant might not know exactly what the regulator is trying to achieve with a deterministic regulation. For instance, certain flow of cooling water is not meaningful in terms of outcome. What you're trying to achieve is that there's water that is sufficient to cool a large light water reactor that the regulation was originally designed for. So I usually give an analogy in this case. What's the difference between deterministic and prescriptive versus performance-based regulation? Deterministic, if you think about a car, says that a car has to have 4 wheels. You have to have a steering wheel. The brakes have to have a certain clamping force on them. The turn signals have to be on every corner at a certain height off the ground. The bumper has to be able to withstand a 5-mile impact without damage. Performance-based regulation would be defining that the car has to be able to maintain going down the road straight. The driver has to be able to control it in some manner to do so. It has to be able to stop within a certain distance. The distance could be the performance objective without specifying, for instance, the clamping force of the brakes. It has to be able to signal effectively to other drivers in other lanes instead of specifying exactly where the turn signals need to be. And that allows different developers to achieve that in different innovative ways. Sometimes it can be very difficult to identify exactly what a viable objective is. And that's a challenge with performance-based regulation. One of those challenges is a risk paradigm in Part 53, which I'll talk about later. The NRC has been working to move to a risk-informed and performance-based regulation for literally decades. They implemented this approach as the basis of how they're going to modernize regulation in 2003, so 21 years ago. Progress has been slow. They focused on modernizing regulations that they thought were the most important at the time. But there has been some progress in important areas, such as emergency preparedness, functional containment, where it redefines the risk to the population and outcomes associated with that area of regulation instead of deterministic values such as a 10-mile emergency planning zone. Instead, it focuses on what's the appropriate emergency planning zone for the specific technology. Others have been mandated directly by Congress, for instance, appropriate environmental review scope. For instance, last year, Congress changed NEPA to require agencies to look at using an environmental assessment, which is less detailed than environmental impact statements when low impacts are expected. The NRC currently requires by regulation environmental impact statement, and they're trying to figure out right now how to move to environmental assessments first without having to change the regulation. That's not a viable pathway in my view. They have to change the regulation, otherwise they're by default regulating by exemption, where they would have to provide an exemption to the regulation to meet the law of using EAs first. But that's, we'll say, an ongoing discussion. Part 53 is a new licensing framework that provides an opportunity to create an entirely performance-based framework from the ground up. Whereas the existing Part 50 and 52 licensing frameworks are very, as I said, deterministic and prescriptive. Part 53 is mandated by the Nuclear Energy and Innovation Modernization Act of 2018 to provide a technology-neutral, risk-informed, and performance-based licensing framework. Specifically, in that law, it says to enable innovation and commercialization of nuclear energy technology. So it's not just supposed to be a framework that exists, it's supposed to be one that does enable innovation and commercialization. So it's a once-in-a-generation opportunity for regulatory innovation. The last licensing framework that was developed was Part 52 in the early 90s. 30 years later, we're looking to develop an entirely new framework again. Prior to Part 52 being developed in the early 90s, Part 50 was developed roughly 30 years before that. So Part 53 could be critical to licensing of new technologies in the future. Unfortunately, it started after interest of or resurgence of potential nuclear energy has occurred. So existing developers that are engaging with the NRC now have to base their pre-application work off of the existing Part 50 and 52. So the NRC is a little bit behind on this, and they needed a mandate from Congress to get moving. That mandate came, since NEMA is from 2018, that mandate came 5 years ago. The staff's first draft proposal had major flaws. After significant stakeholder feedback and 2 letters from Congress, it went to the commission in March of last year. After a year of review and further engagement from stakeholders like the Breakthrough Institute, the commission finally voted on the path forward for Part 53. In most cases, the commission changed staff's proposal to align with the consensus report that Breakthrough authored in conjunction with many other NGO groups. So the current status now is, hopefully it's on a better track. The NRC staff is working on a new draft that has to be released in September. In the meantime, we and others continue to engage with the commission and some of the staff, although there hasn't been any formal public opportunities for engagement. That might change in July when they plan to have a workshop on a specific component of the commission's vote, which is a comprehensive risk metric. What does that mean? Nobody knows. The commission was very broad in how they define comprehensive risk metric in their vote. They denied the staff's approach to using a risk metric, which is known as a quantitative health objectives in the rule, at urging from other stakeholders, including myself. So it is almost a open-ended question what a comprehensive risk metric will be in Part 53. And there's going to be a lot of work to be done to define what that should be. One thing that it should be is risk-informed. Risk-informed means regulations focus on the most important areas of risk. So a regulation should weight decision-making on things that are more important to risk reduction to the public than things that are inconsequential to risk to the public. All things are not equal in risk, and all things should not be similarly equal in decision making. The initial mandate for Part 53 was that it would be as safe as existing regulations, Part 50 and 52. But to define as safe as, you need to be able to do a cross comparison. There's no definition of what reasonable assurance of adequate protection, which is the NRC's mandate in the Atomic Energy Act, actually is defined as. So it's challenging for the staff to say that a very innovative approach to regulation is as safe as Part 50 and 52 if some provisions simply aren't in Part 53 that exist in Part 50 and 52. However, Congress has defined what an ample margin of safety for the public is in terms of the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act gives EPA overarching control of radiation protection, not the NRC. And that ample margin of safety is roughly 2 orders of magnitude less strict than what the NRC currently uses as its appropriate level of risk. So the NRC has significant latitude to update its regulations and enable that innovation for advanced reactors while still preserving what an ample margin of safety is to the public according to law in Congress. That means that a crosswalk between 50 and 52 and Part 53 is actually less important than the NRC staff has considered in the past. It also means that this congressional mandate on what is an ample margin of safety should be considered when the staff tries to redefine what a comprehensive risk metric is for the new draft of Part 53. There has been substantial bipartisan congressional action for nuclear energy. This means that nuclear energy is largely not a political debate. Congress acknowledges there is need for modernization and regulation and many other areas. Some major bills that have passed over the last several years include Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act, which mandated Part 53, but also several other changes at the NRC. The IIJA, which most people know is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, which funds demonstration projects, including the ARDP projects for TerraPower and X-Energy. The Inflation Reduction Act, which provides technology neutral credits for once, instead of in the past, we've had specific technology credits for wind or solar or nuclear, and provides credits to keep existing plants operational online because they are very important to any climate goals. Separate bills and funding to stand up the fuel supply chain, $2.7 billion, was recently unlocked by authorization and signing into law of the separate bill which bans import of Russian-based uranium and fuel products. So there's been major action by Congress to update laws and regulations that have been stagnant and not kept up with either the technology or the needs of the public and industry to actually deploy new reactors. The ADVANCE Act is the current step in process in Congress to continue this effort. It addresses many of the remaining issues, including the mission alignment being that the NRC doesn't currently consider benefits to society of nuclear energy and other radioisotopes, even though that is mandated in the Atomic Energy Act and Energy Reorganization Act. That's why Congress calls this a mission alignment. It places into the NRC's mission that it should consider benefits to society as it should not. It is stated that it should not unintentionally or unnecessarily inhibit those benefits either. So while maintaining safety to the public and protect the environment, it should not also inhibit benefits unless necessary. We think that this is an important provision because it changes how the NRC approaches regulation decision-making. And many decisions currently where the NRC could or should consider benefits to society because outcomes to protect the health of the public and the environment would be equal in either case, those benefits are not currently considered. Other provisions include expedited licensing for nth-of-a-kind designs, particularly ones with design certifications or where designs have already been built and started operation. So not first-of-a-kind designs, but once the NRC has licensed these and these plants are online, then more streamlined, efficient licensing process would be required, particularly 18 months for a licensing decision and 25 months to actually go through the hearing process and finalize the license. Changes to export licensing requirements and limitations for certain countries such as Russia and China. Modernization or adjustments to licensing fees for applicants, where the portion of the NRC's hourly rate that only pertains to the actual licensing decisions or work would be charged to the applicant. Roughly half of the $321 per hour fee goes to overhead for the NRC. That portion would be removed from licensing hourly rates. And also funds first movers of many different approaches and technologies. For instance, the first applicant that would use Part 53 would be eligible for what is named in the bill as a prize. Essentially, it's a cost share grant. First applicant that would use reprocessed fuel would be another example. Support and for modernizing regulations and clarifying what would be required for licensing on brownfield sites and requirements to use as much of the existing information from that site as possible instead of requiring fresh information. Currently, for environmental reviews, most agencies require data that is between 3 and 5 years old at most, whereas retiring coal plants data is 30 years old. The NRC would be required to use that to the maximum extent possible, although it still might not be sufficient on its own. It should help leverage existing data to speed up decision making. It provides substantial support for NRC staffing in terms of broadened hiring authority for critical positions and pay increases for certain critical positions as well, so the NRC can attract the talent that it needs to be able to license some of these new designs. Right now, the NRC does not have sufficient staff to license more than 3 applications at a time. Right now, it's also already reviewing 2 applications. So if a third application comes in by the end of the year, and the NRC is potentially expecting 2 applications, 2 additional applications by the end of the year, that would be beyond the capacity that it currently has to review it in an expedited fashion. It requires the NRC to make some of the adjustments to modernize environmental reviews, both in terms of timeline and to make conforming regulatory changes based off of the NEPA changes from last year. Congress feels that the NRC is moving slow to incorporate those NEPA changes, so it's forcing them to do so. And changes for potential licensing of fusion reactors. The Advance Act was based off of 2 different bills, the Atomic Energy, the AEAA in the House, and the Advance Act in the Senate, that were very similar bills. They have since been reconciled to be the same bill in both chambers, and the House passed the bill with an overwhelming majority vote. It was 393 to 13 in the House. The Senate version was attached to the FAA bill, but then pulled out because there were too many other bills attached to the FAA bill, so they ultimately passed that bill without attachments to it. So the Advance Act is looking for a different vehicle in the Senate, or an opportunity to just pass as a standalone bill on the floor. Due to the very large bipartisan nature last time, the Advance Act was called up attached to a different bill. It was voted, I believe it was 92 to 5. The Advance Act would pass the Senate if they could get it into the rotation to be voted on. To help enable that, we are asking citizens to take action and contact their senators to make them aware of how important moving the Advance Act forward in the near term is to them. Although we do not expect a lot of opposition from senators, this is the kind of bill that could potentially stagnate as other more politically charged bills coming up to an election. So we would like to get this to move forward in a timely manner, so it doesn't become a political issue when it currently is not. And to do that, senators need to be reminded that it's not just organizations like the Breakthrough Institute that think that this is very valuable, but individual citizens as well. And with that, I'm happy to discuss any of these things further.
Thank you so much, Adam. Your wealth of knowledge comes through. I'd ask people to raise their hand digitally on the reactions button, and I'll call upon people. I'll take my role as moderator to ask one question. Is it too late, Adam, to make kind of amendments now that the House has passed its version, or is there still kind of opportunity to make it stronger, the language in the bill?
At this point, it would be more disruptive to amend the House version than beneficial. There are more issues that need to be addressed in the future. This won't be the last bill on nuclear energy. So it's important to get this across the finish line and then look at what the next bill would be.
Adam, you can call upon people, or
Jim. Jim, you are muted.
Sorry. Two quick questions. One of them is real quick. The mission realignment part that you talked about in the Advanced Act, was that in the House bill?
Yes.
The reconciled version, it's in that.
Correct.
Great, great. Okay. The other question concerns earlier, you talked about Part 52 versus Part 53, and NRC having to make a determination that it was at least as safe as Part 52. And I'm sitting here thinking, wouldn't that kind of be reactor design dependent, or like comparing the safety of two regulatory approaches? Wouldn't that be hard? You wouldn't be able to get a yes or no answer that's kind of generically true. Am I right?
That's absolutely correct, because the Part 50 and 52, because they're deterministic, they don't have a single metric in them that the staff could point to and say, these new requirements meet the same overarching risk metric, and therefore they're similar. They have deterministic things, deterministic regulations that prior commissions say would result in safety. So without a direct comparison, there is no way to say that they're as safe as. And with specific new technologies, similarly, there's no way to say that that technology would be exactly the same. Let's go with NuScale, because NuScale's UAMPS project planned to use dry cooling, non-water-based cooling, which is different than large light water reactors, which all have water flow cooling, whether it's once through or a closed loop or whatever. And the NRC had difficulty even using Part 52 to determine whether that dry cooling meets their deterministic requirements, because it requires water pumps currently. So innovative technology approaches are very hard to say they're as safe as one another, even in the same Part 52 framework, which is part of the reason we need to focus on performance metrics and not these deterministic metrics. What many reactors have to do, including NuScale, which use Part 52, an existing framework, is licensed by exemption. They need to say these regulations don't apply to my technology, and then somehow attempt to prove that to the regulator's satisfaction. Cliff, I think you were next in line. You are unmuted, but I cannot hear you. I cannot. I'll come back to you if you can figure it out. Stuart.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, great. Okay. Something works. How does our current and proposed future regulatory environment compare internationally, like with France or the UK, or because this has to be implemented globally if we're going to have an impact?
Our regulatory environment is considered by many to be the gold standard, but that is generally because of the extreme detail that our regulator has put into this work. And many other regulators cite or sometimes wholly incorporate the NRC's guidance documents in their own regulation. So changes to the NRC regulations do affect other countries directly. Many of them actually use several versions prior of certain regulatory guidance documents because they didn't want to have so much flux with their own regulations. They use older versions. However, most have a different approach to regulations. They start with what we would consider design certification, looking at the design to see if it is safe. And then separately look at the site characteristics. The design certification in the US is the most lengthy approach to licensing. It's what NewScale did with their first design. It's Part 52. You generally would use that approach when you know your design is ironed out and you want to build many of the exact same design and not have the regulator question every detail of your design every time. Most other regulators start with that. And you generally have a longer upfront, and then you address site-specific issues for each site you want to build it at. The NRC, the normal approach is that you do general site characteristics and initial risk analysis for your design for construction permits. And then you do more detailed of both when you actually want an operating license after it's built. So it's kind of the reverse. And that's part of the reason why the IAEA has failed to harmonize regulations among countries over the last 26 years that it's been attempting to do so. Different regulators have different approaches, and none of them want to say that a different regulator has a better approach and therefore they'll adopt it. Everybody wants to say my approach is the best, and so everybody else should conform to mine, including and especially the NRC. Cliff, is your microphone working now?
You tell me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Okay. I'm sorry. And maybe this is not the right question for you, but I'm just curious if we compare the old Part 52 with Part 53, assuming an excellent implementation, how much money do you think we could save?
Well, with the draft of Part 53 the staff provided, they estimated that an applicant would save a couple $1,000 versus a potentially $50 to $70 million price tag. So that's a rounding error. A couple $1,000 off of 50 million. Totally in the statistical noise of whether that would even occur or not. With the potential draft that will come out in September, assuming it aligns with the stakeholder consensus that we helped develop, it could be, I estimate, roughly 30% savings for the first reactors and potentially 50% savings for nth-of-a-kind reactors, because you can show that you are meeting the objectives, the performance criteria objectives, even if you change your design as your design evolves, because you've built one or two or three. You want to make slight tweaks to the design, you still can achieve the objective without having to go through the entire licensing process again or apply for licensing amendments. So that allowing the innovation is necessary to also enable cost reductions by building many of them and learning from. Right now, if we license one and then we want to learn from it and do something different the next time, we need to go through at least part of the licensing process over again. Ray, I think you were next.
I've got two questions. The first one is, can you comment on the current leadership at the NRC, whether they're pro-nuclear enough to implement any changes Congress requires or are changes needed there? And the second question is related to nth of a kind approval. When we get to mass producing nuclear reactors like we need to, quantities of one per day or more, can we get to a point where one approval is all you need to manufacture whatever number, and then just a site approval that could be abbreviated based on the fact that these reactors are likely to be in a container and fairly portable?
Sure, I can comment on those. The first was the makeup of the commission. There's currently 4 commissioners that have all said that nuclear energy does benefit society, and that it is, every one of them has said that it's important to address climate change. They were very hesitant to vote in that direction in the past. However, the commissioner that left last year, Commissioner Barron, generally voted against all regulatory modernizations. He's no longer on the commission, in part because Breakthrough Institute highlighted his vote record as being objectively against nuclear energy, despite him saying that he was supportive of it. Since then, other commissioners that were roughly aligned with Commissioner Barron, former Commissioner Barron, have changed direction on their own. The Part 53 vote would not have gone through as it did, align with our consensus report, had Commissioner Barron still been on the commission. So now I think they have seen that they do need to make some progress. In terms of nth of a kind licensing, the NRC would say that they're already doing that. That would be a design certification. You would certify that specific design, and then you would just get site level approval. However, there are other efforts to streamline that further, one of which is in Advance Act, which is part of the reason that it is important to finalize Advance Act. Another is a manufacturing license approach, where you would manufacture and fuel reactors that are small enough to ship fuel in a factory, and then ship them, test them in the factory. So you've already done most of your manufacturing and testing in a factory setting instead of on site, ship it to site, and then after setup, have a little bit of oversight, review, and then startup. That approach is being looked at for microreactors only, but we're strongly trying to drive that towards only performance-based metrics instead of it being written as being microreactor specific. That way we can pivot it to other reactors later when it's appropriate.
Yes, I'm talking about 100 megawatt reactors. And thanks for your answers.
Sure. Eric.
Hey, Adam, thanks for your talk. Always a pleasure. I wanted to bring up, this kind of occurred to me this year. Obviously, this is an election year, and people are talking about candidates, and RFK Jr. is getting a lot farther than I ever thought was possible. And so people are kind of looking into a lot of his critiques of various things, including his critiques of nuclear energy. And this principle is being written about more the precautionary principle, which kind of taken to the extreme is to ban anything that might be dangerous rather than allowing something and only banning it after we have demonstrated that the costs outweigh the benefits and that the danger is too great, and we all agree upon that. So I'm wondering if you think that that is kind of a worthy concept to kind of expose more as being fallacious as it's applied to nuclear energy, and at the risk of, you know, dividing audience more with all these controversies of talking about the similarities of how people feel about GMO foods or synthetic fertilizer or vaccines or now with AI or all of these other things. So that's a lot, but curious what you have to say.
That is a lot. So we already regulate under the precautionary principle for nuclear energy. That was a result of splitting up the Atomic Energy Commission into what became DOE and the NRC. By only giving the NRC regulatory and licensing requirements and not making sure that the mission was already aligned to consider benefits to society, the result was the NRC only considers the risks, and therefore licenses essentially under the precautionary principle, not to the extent of a ban, but to very strict regulations. So the precautionary principle could be taken to consider a ban. But in most cases, for instance, this is how Europe does regulation under the EU. They use a precautionary principle and they regulate toxins, chemicals, etc., to a level that is low enough that even if there is exposure, you wouldn't expect to have significant impact. That's exactly what we do in the US with nuclear energy right now.
So the precautionary principle is like on a spectrum, you might say?
Very much so, yes. Very much so. That's a very deep topic to get into in the risk analysis sphere. What is the precautionary principle? Where should the starting point be? People have different opinions on it. In my view, the opinion that matters for nuclear energy is what Congress has already passed under the Clean Air Act, saying what is ample margin of safety. And I'm currently trying to get the NRC to understand that that's actually what the law says and what they should do.
Cool, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Rodberg is lost his voice today, so I'm asking his question here. His question is about the risk paradigm. So following up on Eric's question here, is there kind of ability to change the LNT/ALARA kind of mindset, or is that something that's currently in the works, or what's the kind of any progress on that?
Well, okay, so that's an in-depth question if I let it be. So I'm going to try to say a little high level first time. There was a rulemaking or a petition for rulemaking, I think 3 years ago, to overturn LNT. That petition was ultimately denied. The NRC leaned heavily on what the EPA determined to be appropriate consideration of radiological risk, in part because, interestingly, they acknowledged in that decision that EPA has overarching regulation of radiation, not them. Although they don't in the other, what is ample margin of safety, like I just mentioned. Give me 1 second. Sorry, my son was knocking on my door. The likelihood of changing LNT through the NRC right now is very small because of that denial of a petition for rulemaking. It would take EPA overturning LNT or specific congressional action, which is unlikely, without further scientific basis. There has been a report from the national academies on what it would take to have sufficient low dose research as a basis for that potential overturn. We would need funding from Congress to actually conduct that study over multiple years. In terms of ALARA, it's part of the regulations for Part 1552. Under Part 53, the staff tried to actually increase the scope of ALARA to also consider design considerations. So you'd have to do ALARA consideration as you design the reactor, not just in operations. Currently, its scope is just in operations, so the design is already approved and you are operating the plants, and if you want to make changes or as you do upgrades or general maintenance, you should do that with as low of a dose as reasonably achievable to the staff, to the plant workers, including it in the design considerations for the plant itself. Would do what most people think Lara currently does, which is force developers to drive dose down to essentially zero before you ever get the plants licensed. That's not currently required. You have to meet different radiation protection requirements that are deterministic right now, not pushed down to zero, but that would have increased that scope substantially. So at least that was a near-term good outcome of preventing the scope from increasing. Keith.
Yeah, a couple questions. So, and I apologize if you've already explained this, but I'm not sure I completely followed. When in the very beginning, Jim Hoff was saying something about how the FAA provisions for nuclear perhaps did not make its way into that bill, or were some aspects of it in there, but not the full scope of the advance that you're that we're seeking. Can you clarify that for me?
Sure. The reconciled version of advance was included in the Fire Safety Act for the House and the FAA bill in the Senate. In the Senate, about a dozen other bills were also trying to become attached to the FAA bill. So ultimately, Schumer decided to strip all amendments out and just pass the FAA bill without any other additional amendments or attachments. So right now, the FAA has passed, but with no other attachments, including the Advance Act included.
Okay. The other question I had was the discussions that we're having here about regulatory reform for NRC. Does that to what extent does that have a bearing, direct or just from a practical standpoint, on American companies that might want to market a reactor overseas somewhere?
The Advance Act has provisions to enable easier export licensing to friendly nations. So our regulatory paradigm, for better or worse, is still considered the gold standard, and most other regulators would be likely to very quickly license a reactor that was already first licensed here. That is in part why, if we want a nuclear energy resurgence worldwide, unless CANDU reactors or KNHP ISMRs or some other foreign designed reactor was able to take over the market, if we want US technology to be exported efficiently, it is important that developers be able to efficiently license here and build here, because other countries will accept that more readily to deploy the technology in their own country than if it came from a different source.
So, like, well, for I guess that helps me understand it a little bit. I mean, I think we know, like, Russia and China are looking at marketing their reactors in other places around the world, right? If they can, and that doesn't involve the NRC at all. Is there any opportunity for a company like Westinghouse, even though it's based in the United States, to play that same game, or not?
As Russia and China?
Well, to market something that it decides itself is safe, or is compliant with whatever the rules are in the country where they're marketing it. And that's it.
That is happening right now. So there's an overlap of some countries that would consider US deployed technology and Russian and Chinese technologies. But for the most part, they're mutually exclusive. Allied nations of Russia and China would be more likely to deploy their technologies. Allied nations of the US more likely to deploy US technologies. There's a Venn diagram where they overlap, and those are the countries that could go either way. Those countries generally don't have regulators at the moment at all. They'd be standing up entirely new industries to support nuclear energy from the start. And Russia and China have an advantage in that they are trying to sell whole packages. We'll help you set up a regulator, we'll build the plant, we'll even operate the plant, and we'll sell you lifetime fuel, all as one neat, tidy package. And the US does not and cannot do that currently, because we can have consortiums of different companies that want to sell one package, but each company wants some say in what's in the package. Each company needs their own profit out of the package instead of just one large chunk where everybody is guaranteed to get something from the state when it happens. But Westinghouse, for example, is already selling packages because they have a fuel division as well. That's part of the reason that they were chosen to be deployed in Ukraine, in Poland, for example, and with their AP1000. There's also other designs that are already slated to be deployed in Poland as well that do not have US licenses, unlike the AP1000, such as the now I lost my train of thought. Well, for instance, Rolls-Royce from the UK has a deal for deploying in Poland that just happened. They don't have a US license. And NewScale has an agreement with Poland for their uprated design that is not yet licensed in the US, although it's roughly derived from the one that is licensed already. So a US license is not a requirement for international sales, but it is very advantageous.
Thanks.
Anyone else?
I think we should call it a day. It's at the top of the hour. Really appreciate your time, Dr. Stein here. Also, this is a request to everybody who is compelled by the work that Adam and others have been doing. Go to the link that I posted, buildnuclearnow.org. Go to the action section and write your elected representatives now, so we can get the Advance Act passed into law, so we can advance along this advanced reactors, export technologies. The NRC's reminding NRC of its mandate includes the benefit of civilian use of nuclear technology, not just regulating it into regulating it away. So again, thanks everybody for the lively discussion. Thanks Adam for joining us, and do join us at the DC conference, and hope to see you at the Nuclear Energy Action Team table. So happy to have people stick around and discuss, but we should stop the recording.